You're listening to episode 60 of A Whole New You podcast. On today's show, I'm interviewing Cyrus Khambatta and Robby Barbaro about their revolutionary approach to mastering diabetes and reducing insulin resistance, a problem that plagues hundreds of thousands of Americans. Cyrus Khambatta, PhD, and Robby Barbaro, MPH, are the co-founders of Mastering Diabetes, a coaching program that teaches people how to reverse insulin resistance via low-fat, plant-based, whole food nutrition. Cyrus has been living with type 1 diabetes since 2002 and has an undergraduate degree from Stanford University and a PhD in Nutritional Biochemistry from UC Berkeley. Robby was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes in 2000 and has been living a plant-based lifestyle since 2006. He worked at Forks Over Knives for 6 years and earned a master's in public health in 2019. This show is one that you will not want to miss, especially if you or a loved one is suffering from diabetes or insulin resistance. Welcome to A Whole New You podcast. I'm your co-host, Kim Maravich. I'm a registered nurse and author of the book 360 Health. I'm joined by my dear friend, Lori Biddle, a health and wellness coach certified through the Institute for Integrative Nutrition. Our show exists to inspire and empower women to take charge of their health, with weekly tips and conversation about self-care, mindset, nutrition, fitness, and clean living. Please keep in mind that the material provided in this podcast is intended as general information only and should not be used as a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. We're thrilled to have you here. Let's get to the show. First, I'd like to read a 5-star review that we received. This is from Jess Pro 1234, and it's titled, Love This Show. I love the diverse topics that they cover in this show. Finding support on things that I would never have thought to Google. Thank you. Well, thank you for leaving this wonderful review. Reviews and subscribers help boost our rankings in iTunes, and they help people find our show who might not already know about it. If you're listening right now, why don't you pause the show and head over to iTunes? There's a clickable link in the show notes. You can subscribe there and also leave us a rating and review. If you do, we'll be sure to read your review on a future episode. Now, let's get to today's show. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the show. Today, I am pleased to have Cyrus and Robby joining us, and I'm going to allow them to tell you a little bit about their backstories. As we mentioned in their bios, they both have been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes and have been living it with that condition for some time now. So I'm going to go ahead and Cyrus, would you like to start for us and just kind of tell us about your backstory, a little bit about yourself and how you came to be diagnosed with type 1 diabetes?
Absolutely. And thank you for having us on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Sure.
Yeah, it's great to talk with you. So, to answer your question, I was diagnosed with, so before I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, I grew up in Northern California, and I'm I've been an athlete my whole life. I played soccer, I've lifted weights, I've been a runner, and, exercise has been something that's very important to me over the course of time. My senior year of college, when I was 22, I was just graduating from Stanford University, just trying to, move on with my life. And all of a sudden, my blood glucose is super high. I'm very thirsty, and I'm extremely tired. So I checked with, I went to the local health center at the school, and they diagnosed me with type 1 diabetes, sent me to the hospital, and 24 hours later, I got discharged with a prescription for insulin, for multiple types of insulin, a blood glucose meter, a carbohydrate counting guide, and a life alert bracelet that basically says, hey, I have diabetes. So
Wow.
Imagine, today everything's normal, and then tomorrow, boom, all of a sudden you become a chronic disease patient. It was like, it threw me for a loop. So, at that time I didn't know anything about diabetes. I didn't study biology. And so what I did was I followed the advice of the traditional medical institution, which is to eat a low carbohydrate diet. And that is the advice that they gave to me back in 2002 when this happened. And it's also the same advice that is being passed around now. And so I started to adopt a low carbohydrate diet because the methodology is simple. If you minimize your carbohydrate intake, then you can minimize your blood glucose, and then that can minimize your insulin use. Sounded logical, so I said, okay, great, let's do this. So I did that. And for the first year, my glucose was supposed to be more controllable. My insulin use was supposed to be stable. But I noticed the exact opposite. My glucose began, I started on the blood glucose roller coaster. Controlling my blood glucose became virtually impossible. My insulin use kept on creeping up, a couple of units, every couple of months or so. And before I knew it, I was injecting almost 45 units of insulin per day, even though I'd started in the low 30s. And I just became very low energy and my muscles were tight all the time. And I just was like, wow, either diabetes is really difficult to live with or I'm doing something wrong. But either way, like this does not seem to be working out well. So I started looking for more information. I then happened to stumble across the idea of being a plant-based eater. One friend of mine who lived in San Francisco said, hey, you should talk to this guy named Dr. Doug Graham, who has gone on to write books. And he's a fruitarian, and he basically he teaches people how to adopt a plant-based diet for incredible health. So under Doug's guidance, he taught me how to, reduce my animal food intake completely and eat a plant-based diet. And within the first week, my insulin use fell by like 35 to 40%. My glucose became more controllable. My energy levels were unbelievable. I was more hydrated. I was going to the bathroom more frequently. And I was like, oh my Lord, this is what I've been looking for the last year. This feels great. So I continued this process. I went back home. I just turned this into my lifestyle. And then I got so excited about this whole process that I decided to put myself back to school so I could go get an actual graduate PhD degree in nutritional biochemistry. I wanted to be able to explain in painstaking detail the molecular biology of what was happening inside of me. And in the process of learning that, I also learned that what I had been experiencing was actually something that has been written about for almost 100 years in the medical literature, and that for some reason all that information has just kind of been buried for a while. So I started to uncover a lot of this information. And then when I was done with graduate school, I ended up meeting Robby, who has a pretty awesome story himself. And the two of us decided that we wanted to really teach people living with all forms of diabetes how they can also transition to a plant-based diet for optimal diabetes health and reduced risk for future complications and increased longevity. So the two of us now, have created Mastering Diabetes, which we can go into a lot more detail about at some point. But the idea here is that we wanted to take our personal experience and turn it into something that we could help other people with. And it's been one heck of a fun process up until this point.
Yeah, I'm really excited to get into the ins and outs of your program because as we were talking before we hit record, I was explaining that coming from a registered nurse background, that this is so contrary to what we learned in nursing school and the way that we were treating so many patients and so many people in the hospital today have diabetes, a lot of them type 2 diabetes as a result of, lifestyle, and it kind of goes hand in hand with heart disease, which is the unit that I worked on. So I am so excited to get into that. Robby, would you mind telling us a little bit about your story before we get to that?
Absolutely. And I just want to echo what Cyrus said. Thank you for having us on your show. It's really great to speak with you. And what we do at Mastering Diabetes is such an evidence-based approach that we really appreciate talking to people like yourself, registered nurses, people who are really in this from an evidence-based perspective. So thank you.
You're welcome.
I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when I was 12, just about to turn 13. So it's about 20 years now that I've lived with type 1 diabetes. And I'm the youngest of three boys. And my middle brother, Steven, was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes 9 years prior to my diagnosis.
Oh, wow.
So I was quite familiar with the symptoms, and my parents were obviously quite familiar with type 1 diabetes. And I had been complaining to my mom for about a week or two. I'm saying, Mom, I think I have diabetes just like Steven, because I'm thirsty all the time and I'm going to the bathroom all the time. And she's like, no, don't be silly. You don't have diabetes. And eventually she and my dad traveled to Florida, and I was at home in Minnesota, and they were looking at homes there. We ended up moving to Florida, and she called to check in, and she said, what's going on? Like, how's everything happening? How's everything going home? And I'm like, I couldn't sleep last night. I was cramping the whole time. She's like, okay, go upstairs, use your brother's blood glucose meter and test yourself. So I did that, and I was well over 400. So you're supposed to be somewhere between like 70 and 120-ish, or 80 and 130. And my brother said right then and there, you have type 1 diabetes, pack your bag, you're going to be in the hospital for a couple of days. And so we went to the regular doctor just to get some tests taken, and they said, yep, you have type 1 diabetes. And that was the first time I'd seen my brother cry. He was just like so sad. Oh, I'm sorry you have to deal with this. And then we went to the regular hospital, and my parents came back. They flew back the next day. And I remember my dad just saying, look, this is just an inconvenience, and you can still do whatever you want in life. And growing up, my parents' attitude towards type 1 diabetes was pretty chill. Like, just take care of it. Like, it didn't really crush me or anything, or really like destroy my life. It's just kind of like, okay, I have this condition and I just have to take care of it. So that's always been the mentality. And I'm really grateful for my parents and how they just sort of let us still live very normal, active, healthy lives. So that was my initial diagnosis story. And then eventually I got interested in improving my health through my dad, like selling supplements. And I just started learning what new things can I do to improve my health. And while I was in high school in Florida, I stumbled across this book. And it's a book we do not recommend. It's called Kevin Trudeau's Natural Cures They Don't Want You to Know About. And he actually ended up going to jail for some misleading claims. And it's just like problematic. But the point is, the book planted this seed in my mind that it's going to be possible to reverse type 1 diabetes. And if I live a healthy lifestyle and I give my body the chance to heal itself, maybe my beta cells can start functioning again. And I had this mindset of, okay, all the smartest doctors in the world, everybody says, no, that's not possible. You can't do that. And I just said to myself, look, if you look at history, that happens all the time. People say something can't be done, and then it's done. So when Roger Bannister ran the 4-minute mile, the smartest people in the world said, no, you can't do that. Your heart's going to explode. And then he did it, and now lots of people run a 4-minute mile. So I really went into this with this attitude of, I will do anything and everything to give my body the best chance of healing. We know that all cells die all the time, and then stem cells create new cells. I'm like, why can't we do this with the beta cells? So in hindsight, it's not that easy. I haven't reversed type 1 diabetes. There's a lot more nuances around the topic, but it ended up leading me to try a lot of different diets. And so I tried a Weston A. Price Foundation diet. I tried sort of a Gabriel Cousens plant-based ketogenic diet. And I learned a lot through all these trials. And I suffered from allergies, year-round allergies. I would take Nasonex and Claritin D and still get sick every year. I had terrible acne in high school. I had plantar fasciitis, wore these big blue boots at night to passively stretch my feet. It was very uncomfortable. I had warts on my feet. And I was just struggling with a lot of standard conditions that people have when they're following a really standard American diet. And so I wanted to improve that in addition to my diabetes health, in addition to trying to reverse type 1 diabetes. So the key point is that the Weston A. Price Foundation diet didn't really do much for my diabetes health. I felt a little bit better because I was cleaning out my diet and getting rid of junk food. And then I did the plant-based keto diet, where I ate no more than 30 grams of carbohydrate per day. And I would consume lots of nuts and seeds, lots of oil, and lots of greens. And my total insulin use did come down, which is something we might have time to talk about today, which is this whole confusion around the ketogenic diet and needing less insulin and what is insulin sensitivity and all that stuff. So I would take a pretty small amount of insulin, like roughly 10 or so units per day, and I was eating about 30 grams of carbohydrates. So that's a 3-to-1 carbohydrate to insulin ratio on that program. Then I found Doug Graham, just like Cyrus, and this guy is teaching about how you can eat fruits and vegetables, and that can help your body detox and not get rid of heavy metals and stuff like that through nutrition, that there's pathways that can happen. I'm like, okay, wait a minute. Let me try this. I'm trying to heal. I'm trying to improve my body's overall metabolic health and ability to regenerate tissues. So I start following this fruit-based diet. The first week I ate nothing but bananas, like literally just bananas. I know that sounds crazy, but what happened was amazing, which is that my insulin sensitivity started to increase dramatically. So of course I started integrating a lot more fruits, lots more vegetables. And now I have a 24-hour insulin sensitivity ratio of in the ballpark of like 22-1. That's a 600% change in insulin sensitivity, eating the exact foods that the diabetes community says you should not eat. And so that's really the message of our book. That's really what we're teaching here, is that insulin sensitivity is your key to overall health. And I know we're going to get into that a lot more about, how many all the chronic diseases that are associated with insulin resistance, and why that's a big deal for people living with all forms of diabetes. But my personal story is that I now eat 600, 700 grams of carbohydrate per day and use a physiologically normal amount of insulin. So that's the goal for people living with insulin-dependent diabetes. You want to follow a healthy diet that is going to help you live a long, healthy, active life, and then inject the same amount of insulin your pancreas would have normally secreted before your beta cells were damaged. And so I experienced that. Cyrus does that, and so do the hundreds of clients we've worked with as far as insulin-dependent diabetes, and thousands of people living with prediabetes and type 2 diabetes that have just completely gotten rid of the condition because they became insulin sensitive once again.
This is extremely fascinating because if you talk to, I come from a little bit of background in the paleo community. So when you're talking about Weston A. Price, that's something that I'm very familiar with. And it's very interesting because if you talk to those people about eating 600 or 700 grams of carbs a day, their eyes would roll. Just like, how could you ever consume that many carbs, especially if you're a diabetic? So I'm so excited to talk about this more because it really is contrary to popular thought processes and opinion. But what I'm wanting to do is backtrack just a little bit, if you don't mind. And can you tell us just a little bit, because you both are coming from a background of being type 1 diabetic, and being diagnosed at young ages. So some of our listeners are older, some have type 2 diabetes, and some are pre-diabetic, like you mentioned, and maybe have some of that insulin resistance. So could you talk to us a little bit about, first of all, what is insulin resistance? If you can just kind of explain that in layman's terms for us. And then how also can consuming that many carbs be okay for someone who is a type 2 diabetic who is not ingesting or taking insulin in any form?
Okay.
I know that's a loaded question, so whoever wants to go first.
Yeah, no, this is the heart of the matter here. So
Yeah.
If you got 20 different doctors and or health coaches in a room together and you said, pop quiz, what is insulin resistance? You might get 20 different responses.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that is because over the course of time, insulin resistance has become a little bit more complicated than it really needs to be, in my professional opinion here.
Mm-hmm.
But through information that's distributed on YouTube and through books and what you can find on the internet, people and medical professionals have many different views on like what actually causes insulin resistance, even though the medical literature is relatively straightforward about what the most predominant causes are. So when I first started studying insulin resistance in graduate school, I was given the task of trying to create insulin resistance in laboratory animals and mice and rats, and then try and rescue their insulin sensitivity through diet, through exercise, through intermittent fasting, through calorie restriction. So we performed a number of experiments to try and find ways that we could rescue them, and some of them worked and some of them didn't. So in the beginning of this process, I had to set out to try and figure out how am I going to create insulin resistance in these mice and rats. And my first premonition was to feed them a diet that's containing a lot of refined sugar, either fructose or glucose or table sugar. And so I started reading a lot in the medical literature, and one thing became very obvious to me very quickly, which is that in research papers that actually that have been previously published, the way to induce insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes, depending on the strain of animal, is to feed them a diet that's very high in saturated fat. And so that was my first light bulb. And I was like, wait a minute, you're feeding saturated fat to an animal and that develops diabetes? I thought diabetes was about sugar. I thought diabetes was about carbohydrate. That doesn't make any sense. So I started reading more and more and more and then performing experiments. And what I found out over the course of many years is that when you feed a mammal, regardless of whether it's a mouse, a rat, a sheep, a dog, a pig, a monkey, a human, you name it, you feed a mammal a diet that is high in saturated fat, in most circumstances, you predispose that animal towards insulin resistance. And then if insulin resistance continues over the course of time, it can then become prediabetes. And then if that continues over the course of time, that can turn into type 2 diabetes. So the question really becomes, well, why? What is it about saturated fat that actually induces insulin resistance? So a simple way to think about this is to think about it as though when you are eating a diet that's high in saturated fat, or even a single meal that's high in saturated fat comes from mainly animal-based foods, meat, cheese, dairy products, fish, eggs, but it also comes from oils that you find, vegetable oils, coconut oils, plant-based oils. Even, nuts and seeds, depending on which nut and which seed, tend to have a slightly higher saturated fat content. And so, saturated fat is in many locations. But if you're eating a single meal or a diet that's sort of chronically high in saturated fat, what ends up happening is these saturated fat molecules they escape through the walls of your intestine into your blood. Then they're circulated through your blood to be used as a highway system to get to tissues. So the first tissue that these fatty acids are directed towards is your adipose tissue, your fat tissue. That's where fatty acids are sort of designed to be uptaken and stored. That's a safe place for them to be. And the adipose tissue has all of the enzymatic machinery that's necessary for uptaking large quantities of fatty acids from the blood, storing fatty acids for long periods of time, and then getting rid of it or exporting it back into the blood when the time is right. In addition to your adipose tissue, your muscle and liver are particularly susceptible to saturated fatty acids because both of those tissues are designed to be able to store small amounts of saturated fat as part of their design, but they're not designed to store large quantities of saturated fat. And so if you're eating a diet that is high in saturated fat over the course of time, what ends up happening is that these saturated fat molecules end up going to all of these tissues, some into your adipose, some into your muscle, some into your liver. And your liver and muscle become overloaded. And when they become overloaded, effectively the cells inside of both of these tissues are now saying, you know what? I've taken on a lot of energy over the course of time. And to a certain extent, they become there's this term that we use called overnutrition, which means that they have a sufficient amount of energy and they're not looking for more energy, regardless of what form that energy comes in. So they become sort of full from a cellular perspective. And then the next time you eat anything that's carbohydrate rich, like a banana or a mango or a papaya or a potato, then the glucose that comes from those carbohydrate molecules is circulating in your blood. And when the glucose tries to get in the cell, it has to use insulin as its escort. So insulin knocks on the door, says, hey, knock, knock, I got this glucose. Do you want to take it up? And your liver and muscle respond by saying, you know what? Under normal circumstances, yes, I would take this stuff up anytime and I would burn it for energy or I would store it. But right now, I have so much stuff that's already accumulated inside of me. I first have to get rid of or oxidize all of this saturated fat because this lipid droplet has grown over the course of time. Not until I am done burning this or, until this thing is a smaller size, am I then available and open for business to be able to start taking up glucose. And so effectively, tissues and cells go into this mode where they upregulate all of the enzymatic machinery required for fatty acid uptake, storage, and burning. And they downregulate all of the enzymatic machinery required for glucose uptake and storage and burning. So effectively, what you've done over the course of time is you've turned your liver and muscle into what's called the fatty acid economy, and you've downregulated the glucose economy. And therefore, that makes it such that whenever you eat carbohydrate-rich anything, whether it's refined carbohydrates from cookies, breads, and pastas, or whether it's whole carbohydrate from fruits and starchy vegetables and whole grains, regardless, the glucose from these carbohydrate molecules can't get into the tissues. It gets trapped in your blood. And then you check your blood glucose 2 hours after that meal, you see a high number, and you say to yourself, well, I guess I can't eat a banana. I had one banana, and now my glucose is in the 200s. I guess fruit is bad for me. I guess I shouldn't eat carbohydrates. because every time I eat carbohydrates, my glucose goes up. So you see how this sort of reinforces this idea that carbohydrates are bad for you and they're going to cause diabetes?
Yeah. Cyrus, let me ask you, we're often told that we need more healthy fats in our diet in general. And like, does this apply? You talked about saturated fats. Does this also apply to things like omega-3 fats?
Okay. So there's basically two types of fatty acids. There's saturated fatty acids and there's unsaturated fatty acids. The saturated fatty acids are the ones that I just talked about. The unsaturated fatty acids are a different type of fatty acid that actually has a slightly different chemical structure. And unsaturated fatty acids are not used for fuel. Saturated fatty acids are used for fuel and for energy to burn and to be turned into ATP. Unsaturated fatty acids are used primarily inside of the membranes of tissues or cells all throughout your body. And they're used in your brain for myelination purposes. They're used in your eyes. And they have very, very, very specific functions that enable them to have very potent biological function, but they're not necessarily used as a fuel. So saturated fatty acids are the most problematic when it comes to creating insulin resistance. Let me back up. Trans fatty acids are the most problematic when it comes to creating insulin resistance. And these are the types of fatty acids that are found mainly in packaged and processed foods that result from a hydrogenation process. So those are the worst for sure. Underneath that comes saturated fatty acids, which are the most abundant. And then underneath that comes unsaturated fatty acids. And the final thing I'll say about this is that every human has a metabolic requirement for omega-3 fatty acids. And omega-3s are absolutely necessary for brain function, for eye function, for sexual function, you name it. And obtaining a small amount of omega-3 fatty acids, I think it's on the order of 2 grams per day is necessary. And it maintains optimal health in the long term. And a simple way to do that is literally just to grind up some chia seeds, like 1 tablespoon worth of ground chia seeds or 1 tablespoon worth of ground flax seeds on a daily basis. Eat that, and then you're done. No need to worry about omega-3s at that point. That takes care of satiating that requirement.
Okay, and our bodies can convert that. Because I've always heard that our bodies don't convert like plant-based sources of omega-3s as well, as if we were consuming fish. So you're saying that's really not the case, that we can absorb everything that we need.
Okay, so I'm going to let Robby answer this question actually, because Robby is an omega-3 master, and I think there's some very important nuances in this whole game.
Okay.
So, I mean, the answer, we went into detail in the book, and I also just want everybody to know, for if they I'm sure there's a lot of medical professionals listening to this. We have put all the citations in our book, there's over 800 of them. They're all on our website. So you can get to them, and we're really proud of it because, we read a lot of books. You look at people's citations, and you thumb through the back of the book, and you're like, okay, I got to write this down. I got to Google it. But in our case, you get to the website, you literally click the DOI link, and you can just go straight to the paper and check it out. So we dug deep into this topic, and like Cyrus said, the amount that you need is very little. And so you can easily get that from, the ground flaxseed, ground chia seed. And you can also, quite frankly, meet it by just eating enough whole foods, because everything has fat. Lettuce has fat. Bananas have fat. Quinoa has fat. Beans have fat. They all have enough that when you put it all together, you can meet your essential fatty acid requirements. Now, the question is, now, if you consume enough of the essential fatty acid, alpha-linoleic acid, okay, can your body convert that down the pathways into EPA and DHA? So that's the question that is brought up a lot. And the big issue here that people have to understand is the same enzyme that does the conversion, that starts this out, okay, delta-6 desaturase, that is the enzyme that begins this conversion process on both the omega-6 side and the omega-3 side. So when you're consuming too many omega-6 fats, that inhibits your body's ability to begin the conversion process on the omega-3 side, because that is the preferred pathway of that enzyme. When there's too many omega-6, it's going to go take care of the omega-6s first, and then whatever's left, it'll start taking care of the omega-3. So that's the big problem when it comes to conversion. So when you're following the Mastering Diabetes method, you're not eating the processed foods and the oils that end up having you consume too many omega-6 fats. So again, we've cited a bunch of research in the book, and people can look into that, showing that there really is no concern when you reduce your omega-6 intake. Does that make sense?
It absolutely does. Yes, 100%. Yeah, and I mean, we know as a society, one of the reasons why we're told to supplement with omega-3 is because we do overconsume omega-6. We're, a society of convenience and convenient foods, and which have all of those terrible oils and trans fats, as you mentioned. So that does help. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Right. And when you're, again, and just to further that, when you're eating, these natural whole foods, you end up with a ratio of like 4-1. And it falls in that category, somewhere between 4-1 and 1-1. And that's healthy and natural and normal. But when you're eating a processed diet with lots of oils, we're talking people are 18-1, 20-1, like really, really out of whack. And that is the main problem.
Now we'd like to take a minute to give a shout out to our show partners, Perfect Supplements and Amazon. Perfect Supplements is a family-owned and operated business that supports local farms. Their superfoods and supplements are non-GMO, third-party tested for purity, and contain no synthetic ingredients, colors, or flavors. They're also organic or wild harvested and fairly traded. Products range from collagen and bone broth powders to plant proteins, greens, desiccated liver, and adaptogenic herbs. Perfect also carries vitamins and supplements from other reputable sources like Just Thrive, Dr. Mercola, Gaia Herbs, Green Pastures, Garden of Life, and Prescript Assist. To check out their wide array of products, go to perfectsupplements.com/Kim. If you use coupon code KIM10 at checkout, you'll get 10% off your order. This is a great way to get superfood nutrition while helping to support our podcast. And just as a disclaimer, it's not the intention of our podcast to provide specific medical advice, but rather to provide you with information to better understand the role of dietary supplements in health. We urge you to consult with a qualified health provider to discuss both the advantages and risks of using dietary supplements. Our other show partner, Amazon, is the largest online warehouse and carries just about everything you need. If you shop on Amazon, which is likely, you can support our show at the same time at no additional cost to you. Simply use our affiliate link to enter the site, then browse and buy, just as you normally would. A Whole New You podcast will make a small commission from your purchase, which helps to support production costs for the show. You can find a clickable Amazon link in the show notes for this episode. You can also go to the products page of our website, awholenewyouPodcast.com, to find the link. If you love our show and appreciate the free information you get each week, please consider buying from Perfect or using our affiliate link when making purchases on Amazon. Now let's get back to the show. And I would like to now, if you don't mind, get into the method, your Mastering Diabetes method. Can you talk to us about the foods that you encourage, maybe the amounts of them, the foods that are on your good foods list or the foods to consume? And you have already mentioned some of those that you don't advise people to consume, especially if they have diabetes. But would you be able to go through those foods for our listeners?
Certainly. So this is one of my favorite things to talk about. I'm glad you're asking because we're really passionate about helping people get really clear guidance on exactly what to do. And we've made a system that is foolproof and very easy to follow. So just to be clear, the Mastering Diabetes method has 4 components. So the first one is low-fat, plant-based whole food nutrition. Then there's intermittent fasting, and there's daily movement, and then there's decision trees. And all 4 components are extremely important and helpful. But within the low-fat, plant-based whole food nutrition aspect, we have a green light, yellow light, and red light category. Now, green light foods, these are foods that we are teaching people to eat in ad libitum quantities, as much as you want when you're hungry till you're full. We're not teaching people to stuff themselves, but you don't really need to limit or be concerned with how much you're eating when you eat these foods in their intact form. So the first category there is fruits. Then we have starchy vegetables. Then we have beans, lentils, and peas. Then we have intact whole grains. So those are the first 4 categories inside the green light food category. And those are all calorie-dense foods. And we emphasize those first because when people transition to a plant-based diet, oftentimes they don't eat enough food. And because it's much more calorie dilute compared to things like beef and chicken and breads and oils, people are getting a lot of calories from those foods, and that gives them the energy they need to live their lives. And when you start transitioning to a plant-based diet, the amount of food you have to eat increases, the volume increases in order for you to get enough energy. So we want to emphasize those foods so people can have be satisfied and stick to the diet and not be hungry. A lot of times people, they just eat a bunch of salads. They think, oh, it's a diet of salads. And then they get really hungry and starving, and then they go eat a cheeseburger, and all of a sudden they have energy again. Like, wow, I needed a cheeseburger. It's like, no, in most cases you needed calories. So that's why we put those 4 categories of food first. Then the green light category also includes leafy greens, non-starchy vegetables, herbs and spices, and mushrooms. So again, those are all important components of the diet. We're not telling people to like just eat, potatoes and bananas all day. The nutrient density of all 4 of those categories are very important. So that's the green light category. Now, the yellow light category, there are foods that are either a little bit more processed than what's in the green light category, or they are a little bit higher in fat. So yellow light foods include nuts and seeds, avocados, olives, coconut meat, sprouted breads, and things like brown rice pasta and stuff like that. So avocado, nuts and seeds, these are whole foods. They're plant-based foods. They're natural. They're great, but they're very high in fat. So we're telling people to be very careful and cognizant of how much they eat, because you can easily exceed our guideline of eating no more than 15% of calories from fat, or no more than 30 grams of total fat per day if you just sat down and ate a bag of cashews without really thinking about how much you're having. You have to put some really consciousness behind that. And so then things like sprouted bread. Ezekiel makes a lot of great sprouted bread products. That's good. It's healthy. It can help people achieve their goals, but it's still not as ideal as just eating whatever that bread was originally made out of. And the same thing when it comes to brown rice pasta. It's great. It's healthy, especially because it absorbs water when it's cooked. So it reduces the calorie density and helps people achieve their weight goals. But it's still better to eat brown rice. The processing, you still lose a little bit of nutrition, and we'd really prefer people eat intact whole grains. So those are the 2, categories of what foods to eat. And then the red light category, these are foods that really it's best to avoid completely or really minimize. And that's just going to be all animal products, which Cyrus basically kind of covered, and processed foods. So, things like coconut ice cream, or, the new Impossible burgers and all. These are just all very processed foods that are not going to help people maximize their insulin sensitivity. And I think one of the more controversial items is that we have oil in the red light category. And that's because it's, again, very high in fat. It's going to be problematic for the process of maximizing your insulin sensitivity. And it's also just simply one of the highest processed foods on the planet. You've removed the vitamins, the minerals, the antioxidants, the carbohydrate content, the protein content. It's literally a purely refined food of fat. So we do not recommend people consume any type of oil. And people are like, oh, what about coconut oil? Well, it's like, just eat a little bit of coconut meat. It's in the yellow light category. Like, what about olive oil? Why don't you just eat some olives? So there's really simple ways to include the foods that people might be wondering about or want nutrition from. Just eat the whole intact version.
Okay, that was my question, because, we do hear about, I'm sure you've heard of, I believe his name is Dr. Stephen Gundry in the Plant Paradox. And he talks about consuming like a liter of olive oil, like a week. And so you're just saying that you can get those fats from the intact sources of foods. Eat the olives, as you said, not consuming the olive oil. Don't need to be doing fatty coffees with coconut oil in it, right? Just eat some coconut meat. Right? Okay.
Yeah. And another thing too for the Plant Paradox and Stephen Gundry, like we have full respect for him, and
sure,
we're not going to badmouth him in any way, shape, or form. But the idea, the actual evidence basis underlying the sort of avoiding eating plant foods is highly exaggerated. They talk a lot about, the presence of things like oxalates and phytic acid and lectins,
Yes.
and how like these are considered quote unquote plant toxins, and that
Yes.
fiber is toxic. And they, they go into these, long discussions about each one of these nutrients in isolation, which negates an overwhelming amount of research that, both from small human clinical trials as well as larger scale epidemiological research that shows that people who eat more plant-based diets have less chronic disease and end up with significantly improved health.
One of the questions that I had while you were speaking was the idea of gluten. And what are your thoughts on consuming gluten?
Okay.
Is that something that is off limits?
No, not. So it's funny. We we get that question a lot actually about gluten, and it turns out that roughly 2% of the population has either celiac disease, which is an autoimmune gluten insensitivity, or a non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So that's NCGF, and it turns out that if you are one of those 2% of the population, then the answer is do your best to avoid gluten. And you can find gluten in wheat, barley, rye, and spelt. Those are the 4 places where it's predominantly found. If you're not part of that 2%, and the way you would know that is because you don't have that, you don't have immediate acute digestive problems, you don't have ridiculous brain fog, you don't have gut gas, bloating, constipation when you actually do eat those foods. If none of that is happening to you, then having a diet that contains gluten, from what we know, from all the evidence that we've seen, doesn't present a problem. And it's even possible, like Robby and I as an example, we have chosen that not to eat grains, over the course of time. So, Robby eats 0 grains. I ate 0 grains for 14 years, and I started to incorporate some grains to a small extent. But the idea is that if you wanted to make that decision as well and eat a plant-based diet and eat 0 gluten, is easily possible, and it's not really a concern.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And you had mentioned in your green light foods that you were okay with whole grains, but really not the process. So we'd be getting rid of the junk, things that have gluten in them, like all the snack foods, all the breads that contain, that just the highly processed forms of breads anyway, by following that.
Yes, and I'm glad you brought that up. And it's something that we're really passionate about, is that the foods and the recipes we're having people eat are very simple. So the book has over 30 recipes, and quite frankly, they're just super simple. There's nothing complex. It's just whole foods put together in unique combinations and flavored with herbs and spices that taste amazing.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask you, and I'm sure you get this a lot too, protein, the importance of protein, and we've, it's common knowledge, not common knowledge, common understanding. I guess you would say that we need to get protein, whole protein from animal sources. So of course that would go against your program. So could you talk to us a little bit about the importance of protein and where we would be getting that?
For sure. It's actually a very common conversation, so no problem.
Okay.
Now, so protein is definitely like one of the main concerns of people who are either eating a diet containing animal foods, or people who are considering eating a plant-based diet. And for the longest time, we've been told over and over and over again that plant foods are either protein deficient or they contain incomplete protein, which refers to proteins that don't have all 20 amino acids. And this idea was first brought about by an author whose name is blank. I'm blanking on. It's Francis Lapay, I believe it is, in a book called Diet for. I'm going to butcher the title. Diet for a New World, something like that. Mm-hmm. And so when the conversation was first brought up, this was sort of this idea permeated throughout society, and it was actually confirmed by experiments that showed that animals, when fed animal-based protein, actually incorporate more of that protein, more of that nitrogen-based amino acids into their structure than did animals who ate plant-based protein. So the idea was, okay, plant-based protein is incomplete. Plant-based protein is less absorbable, therefore plant-based protein is inferior. But it turns out that, number one, plant-based protein is not incomplete. There's literally only one protein that's commonly found in food that's incomplete, and that is gelatin. That's it. Okay. Other than that, every single protein that either comes from an animal or from a plant is complete in the sense that they have all 20 amino acids. So when this idea that plant-based proteins are complete was brought about, it was just flat out bad science. It was false, and it wasn't intentional. It was just wrong. So since that time, a lot of people have sort of continued to believe this. Now, the truth is that all plant foods, whether you're talking about a banana, whether you're talking about beans, lentils, whole grains like wild rice, or even a pineapple or squash, doesn't matter. Every single one of these foods contains protein. And if you sum total all the protein that you're getting from, small amounts of protein that you're getting from all these plant-based foods over the course of a 24-hour period, what you'll find is that the amount of protein that you're getting in total is most of the time completely adequate. It absolutely meets your protein requirements and is not necessary to eat animal-based foods that are protein-rich in order to just meet your protein requirements. In addition to that, there's also a number of other reasons why plant-based proteins are actually shown to be less inflammatory. They also happen to come prepackaged with fiber, and people who eat more fiber in their diet actually end up eating about the equivalent number of grams of protein. So this idea that like protein is inferior from plants and that you can't get enough of it is just, in my opinion, is just poor science. And unfortunately, these problems still persist, and we have to sort of continue to teach people that plant-based protein is actually a phenomenal option and very readily available.
And I thank you for that, because I do think that, one of the goals of this show is to provide many different stances on nutrition and healing. And I think that, you guys, you're such a testament to the fact that we can heal our bodies and that we can reverse disease states to an extent. And I think it's important that we really understand, because you're very science-based. And I love that you have clickable links on your website that, and people can find all of the studies that you're referencing in your book. I think that's really important, because there's so much fad diet culture out there. And what we are reading in a magazine, sometimes we're taking it verbatim for this is the diet I should be following, and not really understanding the science behind it. So
Sure.
I know that you're speaking about this a lot, but I do appreciate that you're explaining all of this to our listeners, because it is important.
I really appreciate you saying that. And another thing we're passionate about is really giving the information to you, to the user, so you can make empowered decisions. Like, we're not saying like, hey, just do what we say, just trust us. It's like, no, here's the information, here are the resources, check it out yourself so you can confirm. And we're very data driven. So if anybody was wondering, hey, am I meeting my protein requirements? Am I getting what I need? You can simply use a nutrition logging app, which we recommend and is a big part of really following the program for people who want to fill out decision trees, is to enter your food into a nutrition app initially, not forever, but initially, to understand what's going on. What are your macros? What nutrients are you getting or not getting? And people will see with their own eyes, wow, these plant foods, the recipes in this book, they provide everything I need. And same thing when it comes to omega-3s. I forgot to bring this up, but if anybody's worried about it, they can get a test. OmegaQuant.com is a great way to get your essential fatty acid profile tested. And you can objectively see, am I in a good place? Am I not in a good place? And what changes are you going to decide to make to see if you can improve it, and then get retested? So it's really a data-driven, evidence-based approach.
Very, very good. And that's helpful for people to know too, that there are lab tests available, not just testing glucose, insulin levels, A1C level. Thank you. But the omega-3s as well. That's super helpful for people to understand that. I do want to ask you though, because there have been people who have followed, as you were mentioning earlier, Cyrus, a low carb approach, and maybe consuming animal protein and fat and lowering their carbs. And they are seeing a drop in, their glucose levels, or maybe their need for insulin. So what do you say to not just the people, but that approach in general versus what you're offering. Do you have any suggestions for like long-term health? Have you seen one approach being better than another? Of course, what works for one person may be different for another.
Mm-hmm.
And you've already mentioned that too. But how about, like a long-term approach to eating? What are you seeing as being beneficial?
Okay. So the key to that question, and by the way, your questions are absolutely hitting it on the head. Clearly, you've done your reading, you understand what people are talking about. So it's really good to be able to like answer these questions that the general public has. The key to the question that you just asked is the term long-term, the word long-term. Okay. In the world of low carbohydrate diets, the short-term results do not equal the long-term results in most situations. And the reason I say that is because the reason that most people flock towards a low-carbohydrate diet or a ketogenic diet, which is the most popular and most recent iteration of the low-carbohydrate philosophy, is because a low-carbohydrate diet or a very low-carbohydrate diet gives excellent results in the short term. So in the first 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, maybe even the first year, people who adopt a ketogenic diet see tremendous improvements in their overall metabolic health. First and foremost, they get rapid weight loss. And when I say rapid weight loss, I mean 2 pounds per week sustained over the course of time. So they see weight loss. As a result of weight loss, they also reduce their total cholesterol levels. They also increase their HDL cholesterol. They reduce their triglycerides. Most people living with diabetes or at risk for diabetes find that their fasting glucose comes down, their fasting insulin comes down, their A1C comes down. So all of these biomarkers are moving in the right direction, and nobody's going to complain with that. That's all good stuff. Like even we love when people show up, participate in our coaching program, and they see that same movement in all these biomarkers. The problem, though, is that over the course of time, the biomarkers themselves start to go in the opposite direction in many situations. And what I mean by that is that if rapid weight loss began the journey, a lot of these other changes in biomarkers happen as a result of the weight loss. So the weight loss is sort of the first domino in the sequence, followed by all of the other dominoes that I explained: reduced total cholesterol, reduced blood pressure, reduced triglycerides, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Once weight loss stops, which it will stop or will slow down at a certain point, then a lot of people actually experience something totally different, which is that they're no longer losing weight. Sometimes they find it, extremely hard to break through any of these weight loss plateaus, or some people even find that, they plateau and then they start gaining weight once again, and they obviously don't want that. Then in addition to that, because the weight loss has stalled, a lot of the times the cholesterol values either flatten out or they start to increase once again. Triglyceride values sometimes start to creep up. LDL cholesterol, without question, is one of the most important markers of your total lipid panel that never fell in the first place. It usually increases. And a lot of cardiologists are now kind of recognizing that that's not a good thing, because the higher your LDL cholesterol, the greater your risk for developing a cardiac event in the future. And so we get a lot of people who come to us because they've done the low carbohydrate thing. They've done a ketogenic diet for some period of time. And in addition to all of the sort of, technical things that I just mentioned, they also end up with a whole bunch of other symptomology. The symptomology could be, oh, my kidneys are ailing and now I've been diagnosed with stage 1, 2, or 3 kidney disease. I have a fatty liver, just got an ultrasound, and now apparently I have a whole collection of fat inside of my liver. Not good. A lot of people end up with digestive problems, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, gas, bloating, constipation. They end up with really bad breath. Sometimes they get hair loss. Sometimes they just get extremely low energy. And so any number of these conditions can start to occur over the course of time. And then at that point, people kind of stop and they go, wait a minute, this ketogenic thing, like, it worked for some time, but now it's not working. What's going on? At that point, we've taught a lot of people in that situation to switch over to a plant-based diet, reduce your fat intake, increase your fiber intake, increase your carbohydrate intake from whole sources. And then they start to see that same improvement in a number of biomarkers: reduced cholesterol, reduced blood pressure, weight loss, more energy, reduced A1C, reduced glucose, reduced insulin. But the difference this time is that those changes stick, and those changes happen quickly, and then they persist over the course of months to years. And, if you look at the research, you'll also find that people who eat more plant-based diets just have less chronic disease risk, period. And we're seeing the exact same thing.
Well, you certainly both have a lot of energy, and I can tell, and you're able to do everything that you need physically, right? You can work out, you can live your life to the fullest. You're still both very young.
If only we could have a picture of Cyrus's abs right now in this podcast.
If only. I did get to see you both before recording. So very handsome men I'm speaking with tonight.
Why, thank you.
Well, thank you. I have learned so much. And I just want to tell you, I love, I am from a traditional medical background, but I did leave that. And I do love when the traditional medical approach is challenged to an extent, because it just means that we're continuing to learn, and it's, as you mentioned, it's research-based. There have been a lot of studies. You yourselves, I think it was your goal to reach 1 million people and help them reverse diabetes. And I just so appreciate that you've taken the time to be on our show and to teach us, because I have learned so much myself. And I am a science nerd, very much so. And you have really helped me think, because, I listen to podcasts all the time that aren't my own, all about nutrition. And I love it. Your podcast is one that I think our listeners should also listen to. Can you give us the name of your podcast?
For sure.
It's called the Mastering Diabetes Audio Experience.
Audio experience. I love that. And I am excited to tell our listeners that your book is actually being released today, the day that this podcast is going to be released. So can you tell us about your book, the title, and where?
Go ahead, Cyrus. Tell them all about it.
Okay, wait, I forgot the title. What's the name of our book again? I can't remember. Okay, so the name of our book, shocking, is called Mastering Diabetes. And so the question is, how are they going to buy it? What was the question?
Where can they find the book? And
find the book?
Yeah,
okay, great.
Yeah.
So people can find the book by the easiest way to do it is to go to our website, which is masteringdiabetes.org/book, BOOK.
Okay.
So you go to that website. There you'll be able to see many ways that you can buy the book. You can buy it from Amazon. You can buy it from Barnes & Noble. You can also buy it from other retailers if you are living internationally. Okay. You can also go to your local bookstore and pick up a copy at your local bookstore. And that's actually something that we highly encourage people to do, because apparently the bestseller lists enjoy it, and they kind of give more preference to people who purchase the book physically. So this is something that we're learning right now, and we would like to turn our book into a bestseller, as every author would, not because we care about the ego boost that we get from it. We could care less about that. It's literally about having this book permeate society and get farther and farther and farther. So the point being is, you can go to the website, you can purchase it online, or you can go to your local book retailer and pick up a copy. In this book, you'll learn all types of stuff. I mean, we go into a lot of detail here about the sort of the biology of diabetes that your doctor never taught you, and a lot about insulin resistance. We teach you about what carbohydrates really are. We give you sort of like a master class on carbohydrates and the difference between them. We teach you about a ketogenic diet. We teach you, we also teach you about how to get started with the Mastering Diabetes method today. Literally, the things that you can do in your life right now that are going to make a huge impact on your diabetes risk and your blood glucose management. And then we walk you through a step-by-step process that teaches you every tiny little change that you can make in the order that we recommend. And by doing so, you'll start to put together new breakfasts, new lunches, new dinners. You'll start to intermittent fast. You'll start to exercise. And then you'll have access to plenty of meal plans and recipes that are designed to make your life and the transition to a plant-based diet very simple. And we sincerely hope that it really does change your life and that you get a lot out of the process, because just like we said earlier, Robby and I were almost electrified when we first tried this process. And we've been very pleasantly surprised by the feedback that we've gotten from now working with thousands of people around the world.
Well, I can't wait to pick up a copy of your book. I do not have diabetes myself, but I can't wait to try to implement this for my own good, because I think we all should be interested in warding off disease in our future, and helping the loved ones around us, because we all know someone who does have diabetes or prediabetes. And we certainly are not a society that typically eats this way. So
Amen.
thank you for all of your hard work, for your knowledge today. It's been a pleasure to talk to you both. And just thank you so much for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kim. It's been an honor to talk with you, and we really appreciate your helping helping us spread the word here. I know there's lots of people around the world that can benefit from this, so we really appreciate all the hard work that you put into it.
Yes, thank you so much. It's really nice to meet you, and keep doing what you're doing, because you're doing great work, and really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, guys. That's it for today. For more from Kim, you can go to kimmaravich.com. For more from Lori, go to simplympoweredllc.com. We're always open to listener questions or suggestions for the show. You can email those to contact@awholenewyou.podcast.com. We'd also love it if you joined our Facebook community and followed us on Instagram. Just search for A Whole New You Podcast. And lastly, if you'd be so kind as to leave us a rating and review in iTunes, we would really appreciate that, so more people can find our show and join our community. We'll see you next week.